Elden Ring is the pinnacle of a genre. Don't let the title fool you, I love this game, and it sits among the absolute best open world experiences I have ever played. However, this game is a true successor to the Dark Souls namesake. Elden Ring presents unapologetic difficulty, challenge, and frustration in a way that can either create unparalleled satisfaction or drive you away entirely from the experience. More than probably any other genre on the entire market, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, Demon's Souls, and now Elden Ring have an identity of their own. These games are difficult, and that level of difficulty will present entirely separate results for separate people. One person might encounter a particular boss and enjoy the experience while becoming irritated at a visible lack of narrative guidance. Another player might encounter the exact same boss and be completely perturbed by the fact that it is mandatory in terms of story completion, but presents an insurmountable reflex and memorization challenge. This game will be different things to different people, and thus reviewing it is no easy task. I'll be breaking this video down into separate halves. First is a non-spoiler, broad strokes review of what the game is right now, and my reasoning as to why it is an incredible overall experience, and the second half of this review will discuss spoiler content, as well as showcase a couple of main story bosses. I will have clear audio and visual warnings before this happens, but please be aware that the second half of this review will contain spoilers. Let's begin. Elden Ring is enormous. I've spent well over 100 hours in the game thus far, actually more like 130 hours since release, but maybe 6 or so was when I accidentally left the game running one night when falling asleep. In that time, I've completed the main story, done what I believe to be a significant majority of all side content and optional bosses, unlocked nearly every location on the entire map, and tested out numerous different builds. I can say with comfort that this game is multiple times larger than previous titles in the genre. The thing is, that comes with its own share of difficulties because the review process up till now has been rushed. I will not pretend to be some sort of last word in the land of gaming reviews, but I need to express a pretty severe criticism right now of the review cycle for this game. To my knowledge, review codes were being sent within a week, or more precisely, less than a week before the game actually came out. This meant that major creators and review outlets were scrambling to complete the majority of content, and most of them probably had no chance at actually doing so. That kind of accelerated timeline leads to things like this. Quote, "You don't need to finish a game to review it, and your editors shouldn't be asking you to do that, especially when it would destroy you to do so. In my 8 years of reviewing video games, I probably finished around 10% of them, and my opinions were rarely out of line with others." End quote. For starters, this completely misunderstands the main priority of a review and mistakes it for just an attempt at replicating mainstream sentiment. That is wrong. Reviews are not an attempt to align yourself with public perception. Reviews are meant to educate an audience from your own unique perspective. If that perspective diverges from popular sentiment, well, sometimes those are the best reviews to actually watch. Additionally, the Dark Souls game genre has a particularly aggressive fan base. If you say anything other than "it's absolutely amazing," you'll be swarmed with comments and criticism about how you are simply terrible at the game, you don't understand, and you need to get good. The community, in this way, is relentless in their pursuit of degrading anyone who criticizes difficulty, and a large number of mainstream gaming publications, more specifically the writers tasked with reviewing this game, are probably aware of that. Being given a game less than a week before it comes out, when the scope of that game exceeds 100 hours with ease, combined with the fact that the community will be relentlessly aggressive should you deign to criticize their long-awaited masterpiece, well, hopefully we can see why that kind of review cycle is destined for problems. I would be willing to guess, confidently so, that the overwhelming majority of reviews for this game that were published pre-release had not even come close to completion. Many of them probably had not even begun to explore the complexity of different builds, and when Elden Ring presents a scaling challenge from beginning to end, masterfully crafted in that way, save a few specific exceptions, failing to do anything other than a couple of areas with one specific build is a failure to adequately prepare for the review. From Software also decided to enact a review embargo, which means that they required a specific set of parameters for pre-launch reviews, and one of those parameters prohibited anything being shown that was beyond the first 2 regions. This creates a pretty severe negative feedback loop. Reviewers are faced with a viciously critical audience whose primary vector of attack is that if you aren't good enough to beat something, your opinion is de facto invalid. Reviewers were given less than a week to complete a game that can be explored for well over 100 hours with ease, and reviewers were barred from showing anything other than the first 2 regions of the game, the same regions everyone had already seen in all of the public trailer footage. What is the logical result? Many reviewers did not even do a fraction of the game's content. They attempted to avoid criticism from a vicious audience by aligning their perspective with a speculative public sentiment, and they hid behind an embargo because there was no hope of an insightful review in that span of time. Keep in mind, There are always exceptions to this. Some people did incredible work in that same span of time, but this kind of scenario leaves me skeptical of the process even more than I already was, which is honestly saying something. All of this is to say that I have done my absolute best to avoid such a problem. I've played in excess of 120 hours. I've beaten every single boss I could find. I received, but apparently didn't choose the better one because I had no idea what to do, multiple different endings, and I've experimented with numerous builds, collected dozens of secrets, and started to hear that constant sound of enemies dying quite literally in my dreams. I have been living and breathing Elden Ring since release with multiple sleepless nights, and hopefully now I can give an accurate review of this long-awaited, imperfect, but also kind of perfect masterpiece. Elden Ring is a multi-platform game, but with that come the multi-platform challenges. Optimization here isn't good, and that's a legitimate problem. In a game highly predicated on pinpoint reflexes, pattern memorization, and intricate movements, frame drops can kill you. In Elden Ring, as of the making of this particular review, they will kill you. I was experiencing horrendous frame drops after getting to about the third region of the map, and on top of that, it crashed maybe 12 to 14 times, like hard crashes, 12 to 14 times during my playthrough. Slight, minuscule performance problems can make the difference between life and death in a tense battle, and as it stands, the optimization and performance is a problem. However, optimization and frame drops are less important than the underlying foundation. For minuscule problems to be so impactful, it means that the combat has been carefully crafted and polished so that your every single move counts. This is no different than the existing FromSoft formula, but somehow here it feels even better. Many people will be looking at this game as a possible entry point. They never engaged with Dark Souls, but damn, that's a lot of hype, so why not try it now? To those people, I say yes. Elden Ring has taken the idea of an open world and seamlessly integrated that with everything prior entries got right. Your ability to branch out, find alternative content, and strengthen your character has been redefined into a cycle of gameplay that feels rewarding, satisfying, and ultimately pays off with incredible results. Dark Souls, and other genre entries as well, has this ability to make every inch of a level feel enticing. What if there's a secret door? What if there's a chest hidden away right there? Where is the next enemy, and what will it do to me? For Elden Ring, that level of intricacy and investment in all aspects of the world has been expanded from linear to non-linear, and from moderate to massive. This entire open world remains engaging throughout the playthrough. Yes, earlier regions are eventually underpowered and you wreck through them with ease, but the danger does still exist, and the rewards are still worthwhile. This kind of open environment is peppered with linear dungeons as well. Mines, tunnels, castles, and more are the subject of a more traditional Souls-like adventure, but somehow the knowledge that this is just a small, isolated section of a larger living world makes exploration within a more rigid instance even more satisfying than it already was when you emerge with a new piece of gear, a new spell, or a legendary item. The map also provides a system of tools to mark locations. You can place skulls, vendor icons, and other indications of what is exactly there, and I would highly advise using these tools extensively because there are actually a lot of quests and various interconnected side narrative pathways that require returning to exact points on the map, even at specific times of day or night. Hardly any of these, by the way, that I have found are actually essential, but getting a unique reward for clearing a fort and returning or finding the person who is willing to give you even more unique rewards because of your efforts, it feels extremely satisfying. Right now, we're in this sort of brief golden age of Elden Ring where not everything has been discovered. It will take weeks for the world to be fully investigated and for guides to emerge on all of its aspects. The YouTube feed, constantly spammed right now with the best legendary weapons and where to find them, will be obsolete, wrong, and those videos discredited with time because right now, in such a beautiful way, people don't know where everything is or what exactly to do. They don't know the relative power. They don't know what the best of anything is. And that portion of the game, at least from the perspective of a creator such as myself, is extremely appealing. As the hours go by, you will be rewarded with a ridiculous number of magical spells, weapon types, and Ashes of War. Ashes of War is a type of augmentation for weapons that can provide different elements, affinities, or abilities, and will be essential to completion at later stages of the game. On top of this, there is a new system by which players can summon spectral companions to help in various battles. I found myself summoning these quite often, especially in boss battles, but the choice is always yours when it comes to combat options. For combat pacing, things feel a bit different than predecessor versions. In Dark Souls, it always felt like you were hunting for an opportunity to deal damage. You would wait, dodge combos, heal, and look for the chance to land a couple of quick attacks. In Elden Ring, it almost feels like you are looking for a chance to heal. You are, of course, simultaneously seeking the right moment to land attacks, but you will also be trying to understand the precise moment that backing away for a potion is even possible to do, because the dynamic movesets for various different bosses and encounters will typically be very, very aggressive. This kind of playstyle at first might be jarring. Having the simple act of disengaging for a flask only to be killed as a result of your effort will create frustration. It will, but when the rhythm of combat is better understood, when the fluidity is mastered, the ebb and flow style pacing creates a kind of respect between you and whatever creature it is you are battling. Knowing what they are about to do, knowing the proper response to that, it takes time and it takes dedicated effort, but the final result is a satisfying progression of noticeable improvement and skill. There is a nearly indescribable number of ways to advance through the world. Not only can you control what region you explore and when, you can also find optional and completely missable solutions for major objectives. As an example, an early boss was giving me a huge amount of trouble, but upon exploring further, I found an NPC character who simply wanted to help me defeat them, and provided a tremendous service, making the fight possible for me to beat. Another example came much later when there was a boss that seemed unsatisfying and useless to fight, but after I beat them, and I got nothing for it by the way, and it was pretty difficult, the next time I encountered them, which seemed a bit more intended and mandatory, they had a tiny little sliver of health and were clearly injured from the prior battle with me. These types of interactions are everywhere, and how you engage with them will shape the world around you and influence your journey in untold ways. In terms of world design, the landscape is unlike any other open world title I have ever played. The jagged rocks seem almost designed to stop you at times from reaching objectives in many cases, but not in a way that actually succeeds. That may sound like a nuisance, it honestly does, but it isn't. The verticality and presence of upward or downward mobility options will let you navigate terrain in a way that becomes satisfying rather than frustrating, which ultimately remedies a long-standing issue in the open world genre of wasted space. There is no wasted space here, because there will always be something to find. A secret item, an invisible scarab who drops a skill or an upgrade, enemies with potential rewards, or a full-on passageway to a completely hidden, yet massively developed underground dungeon with its own bosses and unique rewards. I haven't even begun to test all of the different unique spells and abilities. I have played a heavy melee character, a dexterity-based assassin, a mage, an archer, and even more builds. I used what I believe to be all or nearly all of the larval tears already, which is the item required to respec your character, so I've done a lot of it, but even with that depth of gameplay and extensive testing that I've conducted, there are more abilities, ashes of war, spells, and summons that I just haven't found or tested yet. Many people chase the idea of individuality in games, and I can say with confidence that Elden Ring has a higher potential for individuality than most other games in existence right now. What you wear, how you allocate stats, the ways you augment, what spells you use, and how much of this enormous world you have plumbed for its unique rewards, all of it coalesces around a central idea that you have complete control. And instead of existing in a game you are defined by, eventually you are defining the game itself. Elden Ring truly feels like a combination of multiple other fully polished video games. It takes all the best aspects of a 13-year journey and puts them together brilliantly. Elements of Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice will crop up when you realize that poise and staggering an enemy's stance are critical ways to gain an advantage in a lot of fights. Aspects of Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Demon Souls will be visible in level design and enemy behavior, but none of its prior siblings could even come close to the scale and depth that Elden Ring achieves, because the sum total of its parts is greater, by far, than any of those parts individually. The game allows multiple playstyles in a way that deserves to be praised. If you want to use a heavy shield and go slowly, blocking everything, you can. If you want to go berserk with fast attacks and highly potent bleeds, you can do that too. If you want to cheese the enemies with ranged magic or a bow from secluded corners, you can do that too. And almost every single playstyle one can think of is represented with gear, weapons, armor, trinkets, spells, and items to complement it. As old as the genre itself, there is a demand by some players for an easy mode, and while Elden Ring does not explicitly cater to such a demand, it offers so many different ways to progress, or options to succeed, or secrets to find that fundamentally change the fight. The list goes on and on. It offers so many of these different options that whether or not you can press a button and make the game easy really doesn't need to be considered. There is a stealth mechanic that actually feels well developed and useful here. There are NPC options to summon at integral moments, companions, upgrades for your weapons or your summoned allies. There is mounted combat in the open world, which will radically change how you approach various different bosses. And all of this combined allows for a sort of fluid experience where there is always something to do. If you are stuck on one particular encounter, you probably also have 30 other things available to you elsewhere. You have items to turn in and levels to acquire. You have an arsenal of gear to switch out and test and upgrade and more on top of that, making it so that there is always something to do. Now, that's a difficult statement in and of itself when other games like Lost Ark exist, which spam you with useless activities, currencies, and items every single day. Obviously, these are different genres entirely and have different audiences, but many games fall into the trap of quantity over quality. Elden Ring doesn't. Elden Ring offers quantity, and nearly all of it is high quality. I am already on my second playthrough, and this will now be the game I spend probably all of my free time playing. 120 hours left me with extensive experience, to be sure, but nowhere near a complete understanding of all game systems, locations, and items, plus the reality that there are almost certainly a selection of dungeons and secret areas that I have missed, or lost access to via specific choices in the story. Yes, story. It's time. Elden Ring has a quintessential Chosen One storyline. This is widely publicized in the initial marketing materials, so I don't view that statement as a spoiler, but when it comes to narrative tropes, I don't see anything out of the ordinary here. I enjoyed the writing, the beautiful cutscenes, the twists, the turns, plus a whole lot more, but the story was also difficult to follow at times, at least for me, often coming across as disjointed. This is a result of the game's deliberate structure, it's intended, which avoids linear guided progression. And for a lot of people that's an excellent approach, but for anyone who is looking for a cohesive, guided, and structured narrative experience, Elden Ring may not offer it, unless you pay very, very close attention. The mythos of this land, the lore, basically the foundations of the universe, were created by George R.R. Martin, the writer behind Song of Ice and Fire, which is the adaptation for popular Game of Thrones HBO series, right? The one that ended terribly after his source material was no longer being used by the writers of the show. He's a good writer, in my opinion. And when you actually dig into what the mythos contains, it is incredibly interesting. I could do an entire video on the lore for this game that would be, I don't even know how long, but I'd need to play it 3 more times first with different choices and different endings. I don't know how many people will play this deliberately for the story, but for those that do, it contains heavy references to various historical cultures, ancient religious tones, and some unique world aspects that are interesting when discovered and captivating when displayed in the many cutscenes. I don't particularly care for story and narrative elements in video games, generally speaking, for the most part, but here, I was watching. I was watching the cutscenes, listening to what was being said, and reading the things that I found, because much like every other aspect of the game, generally speaking, the world, lore, and story is crafted with extreme care and detail. In terms of spoiler-free assessments, this game is worthy of the hype it has generated. There are flaws, mainly performance issues and crashing, plus frequent disconnections during online play, and the PvP balancing, from what I've seen, though I haven't really engaged with the system just yet, is rough around the edges at best, plus the added frustration that certain bosses and relative balancing will become a roadblock towards the final stages of the game for specific builds, but I'm not focusing on all of those areas because the foundation here is absolutely incredible. It won't be for everyone, and a lot of people are going to buy it, hate it, and regret the purchase because they just don't like the genre itself, but Elden Ring will have a massively expanded player base over previous entries, because it has, and will, earn their respect. I don't want to give this game a numerical score, not because it would be a bad score, it wouldn't, it would be as close to a perfect 10 as I can realistically give, understanding that my personal definition of a 10 is literally unattainable perfection, but rather because a numerical score does not do justice to what the game has built. If you like open world games with highly satisfying encounters, extremely demanding skill benchmarks, and a colossal degree of freedom in your progression, play Elden Ring. If you don't enjoy open-ended progression, relatively complex build mechanics, dying 20 times on a boss to learn and just memorize the movesets, and a narrative experience that diverges from the typical guided structure of most modern video games, then it may not be the game for you. It's important to understand this before purchasing, because Elden Ring is an absolutely amazing game, but it's not for everyone, and a lot of people will not enjoy it. That's the end of the spoiler-free section. Here's the warning. From now to the end of the video, there will be heavy spoiler discussion and specific mention of bosses, mechanics, and visuals to match. If you want a blind playthrough, now's the time to leave. Elden Ring has, at times, rather unclear boss mechanics. As you progress through the game, you will encounter mandatory bosses, demigods plus a few others, who must be defeated in order to end the campaign. Some of these bosses are strong or weak to various different elements, mechanics, or tactics, but the game is not going to express that fact to the player. As an example, there is an endgame boss called the Godskin Duo, which will present an enormous challenge to melee characters in particular, because of the fundamental mechanics. The Godskin Duo is required and pits you against 2 enemies, one fat, one skinny, though they're the same speed basically, who need to be killed. Except it's not that simple. Intuitively, one might assume that you kill them both and the fight is over, but that's not actually the case. If you kill one, it will be resummoned soon after. The next thought might logically be that you need to kill them both at or near the same time, but that's also not the case. They will just be resummoned again. The answer is that you need to kill them each roughly twice because their own health bars are completely disconnected from the actual health bar. What the game isn't going to tell you is that these enemies, among others, this is just the particular wall that I encountered, are extremely resistant to certain types of damage. I was spec'd all the way into Faith, dealing ridiculous damage to almost every other enemy in the game, and shredding through content. But these two, they presented a nearly impassable challenge, so much so that I had to go do hours of farming and completely switch my build in order to progress. My solution was to spec into bleed damage, but this required time and runes and calculations and even a few Google searches to see what had been discovered so far on the halfway developed wiki. Keep in mind, I was doing all this before the resources for the game had been fully developed, so there were no real guides on it. I prefer it that way, most of the time, I do, but it's just something to keep in mind when you consider that pre-release reviews had no resources at all, and most of them didn't even make it to this point. While calculating my bleed build, I was doing some testing, but it turned out that augmenting claws with Ashes of War so that they had the blood weapon characteristic didn't actually improve my bleed build setup in the stat panel. It went down by 2 points, from 60 to 58. However, when I actually tested it, the bleed damage was much higher. Side by side of a bleed proc, even if there was a discrepancy of 2 versus 1-handed attacks at that moment in time, the bleed for a weapon with less bleed buildup had improved in both damage and frequency. That's difficult when you realize that the stat panel in this game is not just intrinsically complicated, it also might be lying to you, or it's so complicated to a point where it intuitively doesn't look like it's telling the truth. I had run into a boss that damn near required me, unless I were significantly more skilled, but I'm not, and I think I'm indicative of at least an average player. I was required, basically, for that playstyle, to respec my entire character away from a build that had worked incredibly well up to that point, right? So, and then after it would have worked incredibly well too. It's just that one benchmark, that one boss in the middle. I got through and then used the bleed mechanics all the way through to the end game bosses, right? And then finished the game with bleed. Bleed build-up for the most part and on most enemies is unbelievably powerful, especially with Mimic tier Ashes, which summons an exact replica of you so that you can feed off of each other's claw bleeds back and forth. But when I realized and searched around for other feedback as well, just how much of a bottleneck frustration that particular boss pair is, I decided to make mention of the experience in the review. However, any complaint I have about that particular kind of issue is offset when I examine other aspects of the world that evolve over time. It's kind of impossible to describe just how incredible this open world is without spoilers, because somewhere in my gameplay after maybe 60 to 80 hours, there was just a giant hole in Limgrave, the starter area. I don't know where it came from, I don't know what the hell caused it, but there was a giant hole, floating rocks, and at the bottom, a massive underground city. I never would have known about this if I hadn't gone back, and then even later, a quest chain seemed to only actually advance because I had explored that particular city. It's hard to even know for sure, but the intricacy here... Oh, and that quest chain, by the way, offered another underground city, which was huge and had crazy rewards. But anyway, the intricacy here and the missable secret areas are huge. Not only that, but I'm pretty sure I got 2 separate endings, or was given the choice at least. And then after looking a couple of things up when I finished the game, I realized that I had been one jump puzzle away from a third ending. There was a secret tunnel behind an altar, and then I don't know what at the bottom, but apparently that was how you unlock a Chaos World ending, which I would have actually really liked to do. Another area is a volcano manor. I had no idea how to get to that place until I accidentally ran the wrong way in a boss fight and ended up on a rock structure, which made me realize that there was an entire area beneath me that could be explored. Again, I am sure that guides will eventually exist for every single aspect of this entire game, but had I just tried to power through the main story and get to the ending location, I would have missed huge sections of the map, each with unique enemies and rewards. If I had gone straight through the main campaign as fast as I could, I probably would have missed more content than I played. Echoing my thoughts from the spoiler-free section of the review, this game will entice a huge number of players that didn't engage with the genre beforehand. That's good and bad, because this new set of players might fall into a trap where they run past a majority of enemies in an area, and then get stuck on a mandatory boss fight, not realizing the sheer depth and scale of this world, which allows them to just come back later after progressing 100 different ways in 5 other regions. Those players might then wrongfully assume that the game has been poorly crafted because they fell into an honestly understandable trap of expecting it to be like other games. In competing open world RPGs, you might end up at a boss battle that is required for completion with no other avenue of progression at that particular moment. In Elden Ring, you will arrive at mandatory bosses like the Godskin duo, that does happen, but you will almost assuredly always have other mechanisms to progress your character, tons of them, to a point where that boss is then easier. Ignoring the reality of this open-ended design will lead players into a self-inflicted gameplay wall, and if they don't find their way around it, naturally or with guides, if they're willing to look those up, there will be angry reviews, zeros on Metacritic, and downvotes on Steam. I won't sit here and say it's okay for such a thing to happen, but I do understand that players who come in with the wrong impression of what Elden Ring actually is will not have a good time. And thus, as the title suggests, a lot of people are going to hate this incredible game, even if that hatred is born of self-inflicted wounds. Bottom line, Elden Ring is an absolutely amazing game that has been painstakingly crafted to combine positive aspects from multiple other titles, and the culmination of that effort is a game with more freedom, complexity, intricacy, and satisfaction than most other video games in existence right now. It remedies some of the consistently criticized entry barriers in Dark Souls, it diverges from tired pitfalls of traditional open world design, and it does all of this with an interesting narrative, albeit very confusing at times, that delivers an overall product completely worthy of the hype and justifiably praised by those who know what they are getting into. I absolutely recommend it. It's incredible. I absolutely believe it is worthwhile, and I think the developers deserve a tremendous amount of praise for their efforts. That's it. If you want support, links are down below, but I'll keep the outro short this time because of the length of the video. Thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.